Hello everyone, and welcome along. Welcome to the 2022 annual Douglas Johnson Memorial Lecture. My name is Andrew Smith, and I'm the Secretary of the Society for the Study of French History. Now, before we begin this evening's lecture, we've got a few announcements for you. Firstly, this event has closed captions, and if you'd like to use the closed captions, you can click the CC button and select Show Subtitles. That should be in your Zoom window. And there's also a chat panel activated by using the chat button along the bottom of your screen. It should appear on the right of your screen. Above the box at the bottom where you type in your text is a blue selection toggle. To dialogue with your fellow attendees, please make sure panelists and attendees is selected. And you'll see we just put a little hello in the chat window. Yes, a warm hello to you all. Yeah, please do feel free if you're attending to share where you're attending from. I'm currently at home in London. This evening's chair is in Leeds. And our lecturer for tonight is coming to you live and direct from our office at the University of Warwick. Now, I should also mention that this lecture is being recorded, and a log of the accompanying chat will be archived with that recording. There is also a Q&A, a question answers panel, which is activated by clicking the Q&A button. Do give it a click. This is the best place for any questions you have for tonight's speaker. It allows us to kind of gather them throughout and then kind of compile them at the end. Tonight's lecture will be given in English, though for the Q&A, you are welcome to submit questions in either French or English. Depending on how chatty you are, it can be hard for the host to guarantee your question being seen in the chat panel, and that's why the Q&A is always the best option, the Q&A panel. Now, if you are likely to post a question, please make sure your displayed Zoom name is correct. You may also include your preferred pronouns. Otherwise, we get a lot of questions from iPad. Also a quick note about questions and all the rest. From its inception, the Society of the Study of French History has prided itself on providing a welcoming and supportive conference environment for scholars of all career stages to engage in academic debate and networking, and also to bring history to the general public. In this spirit, and with a continuing commitment to promoting equality and diversity in the conduct of our business, please take note of the following code of conduct to be observed at all SSFH-sponsored events. All participants should be treated with respect and are entitled both to a hearing for their views and to feel secure in the online environment. All participants are also expected to speak and behave in a way which avoids causing others to feel disrespected, harassed, or threatened for any reason. All participants should respect the authority of panel chairs, most notably over the timing of interventions and over the management of the discussion. If you'd like to raise any issues or report behaviour not aligned with the Society of the Study of French History's Code of Conduct, please use the chat to message privately either the chair or Zoom controller, and an SFH committee member will be in touch. Finally, in the event of internet disruption, please do locate this evening's Zoom link from your emails or from the Eventbrite page, and then you can click back and return to us as soon as you are able. Now, I should mention I've got a glass of wine with me, so this does qualify as a work event if anyone's watching at home. But without any further ado, I will retire to enjoy my glass of wine and watch tonight's proceeding and welcome along thereafter on screen our chair for this evening's lecture, who is Dr. Sarah Barker from the Society of Study of French History Committee and also University of Leeds, who will be your chair for this evening. And so over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Andrew, and welcome everybody to the 12th Douglas Johnson Lecture, hosted by the Society for the Study of French History and the Association for the Study of Modern and Contemporary France. Douglas Johnson supported the establishment both of the SSFH and the ASMCF in the 1970s. And talking to colleagues, he was known for his support of Franco-British collaborative initiatives, which promoted the better understanding of each other's history and politics, which I think is something we can all get behind. He published frequently on French history, both in academic contexts and in wider publications. He was known as a great correspondent and as a supporter of future generations of French historians, and we are honoured to remember him with this lecture. Before we get to our speaker for this evening, we have a piece of happy news to share. As is traditional, we take the occasion of the Douglas Johnson Lecture to announce the winner of our undergraduate dissertation prize. The judges this year remarked on the very high quality of submissions and the exciting range of topics being covered by our undergraduates, which is very encouraging for the future. So I'm delighted to announce that the winner for the Society for the Study of French History's undergraduate dissertation prize this year is Claire MacLeod from the University of St Andrews for a study entitled Not Just Paris, the Development of 17th Century French Provincial Book World. The judges highlighted the work's sophistication and its nuanced engagement with scholarship. So congratulations, Claire. I'm giving you a bit of a round of applause here, and I'm sure everybody else listening is congratulating you as well. So now to our main speaker, I am delighted to introduce Professor Penny Roberts of the University of Warwick. Penny's work, I think many of you will know, is absolutely vital for anybody wanting to understand the complexities of late 16th century France. From her early work on Troyes through her groundbreaking work on priest-making to her most recent work on truth, Penny's work continues to set agendas for future research and has led to her recognition by various bodies, including the Royal Historical Society and the Institut des Études Avancées de Paris. She's done this whilst taking on significant roles at Warwick, where she's currently Vice-Provost and Chair of the Faculty of Arts, and within the Society for the Study of French History, where she's been a committee member, a trustee, and now is our president. And I'm sure she will not mind me saying that she is incredibly supportive of other scholars, as I can personally attest over several years. As was noted earlier, we'll have the paper, then we'll have a brief break, and please use the question and answer function to share your questions. So without further ado, I am absolutely delighted to welcome this year's lecture from Professor Penny Roberts, the St Bartholomew's Day Massacres 450 years on. Penny.
Thank you very much, Sarah. It's a real pleasure to be here. I can't see many of you, but I've seen your names popping up, lots of familiar names. So I'm really touched that so many of you are attending, so many people I know and don't know as well. And it's a real honour to be giving this 12th Douglas Johnson Memorial Lecture. Sarah's already said a bit about Douglas and his role both within the Association for the Study of Modern and Contemporary France and also with the Society for the Study of French History. And often his family are in attendance at these events as well. So if they're out there, welcome to them too. I didn't know Douglas myself, but he was a long time professor of French history, of course, at UCL. But in preparation, I sought the recollections of my former supervisor, Bob Knecht, who actually worked with Douglas Johnson at the University of Birmingham in the 1960s. He remembered him as an entertaining raconteur, popular with colleagues and students alike, and who liked to embrace French ways. And indeed, as it says in his Wikipedia entry, he was unashamedly Francophile. I'm also aware, of course, of joining a distinguished list of previous speakers and therefore the burden of that particular posterity. I also want to thank the Institut Français, which since 2015 has actually hosted this event, except last year and this with the switch, of course, to online, given our current circumstances. That's unfortunate, of course. We'd very much like to be doing this in person, but it does allow also for a more global audience, and many of you who wouldn't be able to attend that lecture are here with us this evening, as it is here in the UK. But this also somewhat shifts the approach of the speaker. I found myself thinking about what that sort of much bigger audience means for this lecture. I have to be conscious of the fact I'm going to be speaking to many people who are real specialists in the field. They may be 16iemistes, like myself, or they may be specialists in other areas of French history, but not necessarily even specialists in the field, but interested at any rate. And especially this is true in reference to my subject today, the St Bartholomew's Day Massacres of 1572. When I was asked to do this lecture, I chose to focus on this event for a number of reasons, partly for its notoriety as the most well-known but often misunderstood episode of the French religious wars, which, as Sarah said, has taken up my academic career. And also, of course, that 2022 marks the 450 years since it took place, and thus provides an opportunity for reflection. And this is possibly the first, but surely not the last of many presentations that will be associated with this anniversary. And I should already have been sharing my screen, so I'll do that now. There we are. And I'll return to these images in a moment. Over the centuries, the events of August 1572 have been variously described as, and of course these are just a few of the many examples I could cite, the most detestable example of fanaticism, famously by Voltaire, both a crime and a blunder, a shameful bloodbath, and more recently, one of the hyper events of European history, one of the most imponderable problems of the 16th century, the epitome of extreme violence, a determining moment in French politics. While for many, the 1994 film La Reine Margot and the 19th century Dumas novel on which it was based may have shaped their understanding of the episode, it was not until April 2016 that a plaque was put up in Paris to mark the events, just 5 months before several others were unveiled, to memorialise the terrorist attacks of November 2015. And so we see this plaque here alongside the medal that was struck by order of Gregory XIII, the Pope at the time, to celebrate the events of 1572 and the massacre of the Huguenots, the removal of the Huguenots by, as it's depicted here, a sort of avenging angel. Looking at the sources across the centuries, as I have done, and it's a vast historiography, of course, we see how they echo each other in various ways, not just in drawing from the same accounts, but in their imagery. Thus, Michelet's emotive assertion that the paper would cry if we mentioned all that happened recalls that of the contemporary Calvinist minister, Simon Goulard, who stated that he lacked sufficient paper, ink, and time to describe all the cruelties. Whereas Henriaux's often cited claim that the massacres have spilled hardly less ink than blood frames rather than reins in the late proliferation of debate in the 1980s that caused Marc Bernard to exclaim, "Stop the massacre." The historiographical debate has indeed proved intense, but I don't want to dwell very long on these well-rehearsed arguments that contrast in scale with the poorly documented uncertainties that have generated them. I'm aware that some of you are very familiar with them, and that's one of the reasons I won't be going into them as well as just how complex they have become. Because I think actually we've reached a fairly clear consensus on the key moments and the role of the Crown in particular, that the royal intention was to eliminate the Huguenot leadership who were believed to be conspiring against the regime, but not to prompt a general massacre, although you could argue, of course, that perhaps inevitably one led to the other, and precious little seems to have been done to halt the violence. Indeed, it's difficult to say anything wholly new about such an exhaustively debated subject, of significance not just for French history, of course, but of wider international importance. And there are so many ways in, and this is what I realized when I started to look at it, so many histories of this episode, from its reception abroad, of which there will be more in a forthcoming volume of French history. I'm making a shameless plug here, which complements that of Roseanne Barr, for instance, on the Netherlands in a recent issue. There's its national importance, its impact on Crown-Huguenot relations, of course, and on the progress of the French reform. Its local context, as local officials and militias made up their own minds how to proceed, both in Paris and beyond. Michelet again famously stating that the Massacre of St Bartholomew was not a day, it was a season. Beginning in the early hours of the 24th of August, of course, but continuing well into September and even in some places into October. And recently, Jérémie Foa has turned our attention to the individual experience, with particular focus on a proper identification of the victims and the significance of the role of a handful of especially prolific perpetrators. So given this range, I'm not going to try and encompass all of this, but I'm rather going to offer some sort of selective dips in a way and reflections on three areas as a basis for wider discussion. And this really, I hope, will expand the interest to a wider group of you. Firstly, there is, of course, the historiography, which it's difficult to avoid, including the contemporary reaction as well as later debates. From there, if I have time, I want to pan out to the broader context of interdisciplinary scholarship and discussions of the subject of violence, of which there's been many recent studies, and then zooming back into the particular local context of events in the town of Troyes, where I actually began my own academic research and where I think there may be more to say. What happened in Paris is key, of course, but what happened elsewhere in response to events in the capital, but also heavily influenced by the particular local circumstances, have much to tell us about the conditions for massacre. And there's always more we can extract, even from familiar documents, as Foa has so vividly shown for Paris, through a deeper dive into the conciergerie and notarial records, in the process humanizing these microhistories. And I'll also attempt a bit of this briefly at the end. So firstly, then on to the historiography. Cette belle apparence est devenue du tout monstrueuse, was said by a contemporary observer, summing up the events of 1572. This beautiful appearance had become totally monstrous. Building on a favourable peace edict of 1570, the symbolic act of reconciliation between the Catholic and Protestant faiths was the marriage of the Huguenot prince Henri of Navarre to the king's sister Marguerite de Valois on the 18th of August. Just a few days later, of course, what seemed like the ultimate act of betrayal took place, with first the attempt to assassinate the Huguenot leader, Admiral Coligny, 4 days later on the 22nd, and then the general order for the massacre of the Huguenot nobles who'd gathered for the wedding in Paris on the night of the 23rd into the morning of the 24th, St Bartholomew's Day. Thousands of their co-religionists resident in the capital were then targeted over the next week. In the 6 weeks following, amid the confusion about exactly what the royal commands had stated, and deliberate and calculated as these decisions may have been, there would be smaller scale massacres of their Huguenot inhabitants in more than a dozen other French towns. Arlette Joanna, in the clearest and most effective synthesis of all we know, and has been written about these events, states that this sudden turnaround has troubled contemporaries and historians alike, and I would add ever since. But it's also clear that the situation was neither as tranquil nor as harmonious prior to the massacre as some contemporaries presented it. And of course, they presented it this way in a way to make a point about the contrast and to make, therefore, the shift that much more shocking. And if we look at the historiography, this is clearly reflected and has been over a number of years. For Denis Richet, it was prepared by 10 years of latent persecution. Barbara Diefendorf, that it was unplanned, though not unforeseeable, explosion of hatred and fear. For Foa, he agreed that it wasn't premeditated, prepared but not planned, as he put it in a recent sort of English presentation, but with a quotation from his French book on the screen. Diefendorf, who's provided us with the most succinct and authoritative take on events in the capital, argues that the situation in Paris was indeed so volatile that the tiniest spark might have set it off, and confessional tensions were no less in other communities. So we have to see the violence as the culmination of at least a decade and a half of disputes. What was very different in 1572 was the degree to which the crown was seen to be complicit with blood on its own hands, if you like, shattering any residual hopes for royal protection, at least for the Huguenots, at least until Huguenot leader Navarre became heir apparent in 1584, this in turn exacerbating Catholic concerns and catalysing the rise of the League. Among the reactions of contemporaries, as Joanna noted, was both the wish to pass over the bloodshed in silence, as was the case with moderate Catholics like the essayist Michel de Montaigne, or to deliberately erase the memory, as, according to his son, did Judge Christophe de Tours, in an echo of the emphasis on oubliance or oblivion that was recorded in successive edicts of pacification, with the first article from 1570 onwards in each of these edicts concentrating on that act of oblivion. He wrote, "May the memory of this day's crimes perish, may future ages refuse to believe they have happened. Yet others like Simon Goulart were determined to provide a full account for posterity, his Mémoires de l'État de France proving to be one of the main sources for later accounts, and the Huguenot compilation, the Histoire ecclésiastique des Églises réformées, declaring that the authors and executors of such an evil massacre would be perpetually execrated for an act of such barbarous and inhuman cruelty, first occurring in Paris and then followed throughout France. While most writing in the 19th and early 20th century largely perpetuated the Huguenot black legend of Catherine de' Medici's responsibility for the murders and their premeditation, amid the evident bias and hyperbole, there were also some more acute observations. Going to Michelet again, who's a great one for quotations of various sorts, while setting up a stark contrast between the heroic Coligny and the evil Queen Mother. When writing about the violence, emphasised the attack of neighbours on neighbours, the contrasting outcomes in different localities, and that local officials took charge of the violence while the judiciary kept quiet. Modern historians have not exonerated Catherine as such, but have nuanced her motivation. Nicholas Sutherland, railing against the maternal jealousy, claimed that she was wanting to act against Coligny's influence on her son, followed by Bourgeon seeing also a greater role for an international Catholic coalition, and Denis Crouzet that the Crown's Neoplatonic dream of concord, embodied in the 1570 edict and cemented by the Valois-Navarre Union, of which Catherine, of course, was very much the chief architect, was threatened by fears about Protestant retaliation. And so we have Joanna's crime of state versus, if you like, Creuset's crime of love, but together amounting to different slants on the same conclusion about the central role of the Crown, principally the Queen Mother and Charles IX, in the events that took place. Even in a period of intense and often brutal confessional violence, the St Bartholomew's Day massacres stand out as much for their scale, at least in Paris and cumulatively with other local episodes, as for the sense of betrayal, as far as the Huguenots were concerned, for these actions during peacetime and a time of supposed reconciliation. The assassination of leading figures on both sides was not unusual, nor was this the end of the use of this device. Smaller scale mass violence was not uncommon too, although it seemed to have declined after 1572. But the open involvement of the Crown and the international resonance was significant. For Huguenots, the period of days in Paris and weeks elsewhere reinforced the shock and sense that no official protection could be hoped for, and the only choice for Protestants was to abjure or leave France. Their leadership and therefore their protection were dead or converted, and therefore it's perhaps most remarkable that the movement was able to rally at all, particularly, of course, in its strongholds in the southwest of France. Violence on such a scale was not to be repeated, although there were fears on both sides of repeat of this violence or indeed retaliation for it. I actually want to go back here. A circumstance not often mentioned is the comparatively young age of the protagonists, or perhaps I should say survivors of the massacre. What we see is a generational shift away from the veterans of the early wars. Admiral Coligny was in his 50s, having recently also lost both his brothers. Also his longtime followers like Briquemont and Cavenne, who had successfully kept hidden during the massacre, but were subsequently arrested and executed at the end of October. In 1572, Charles IX was but 22. His brother Anjou, the future Henry III, who many see as a central figure in the massacre, was not quite 19, and the king's other brother, Alençon, was only 17. The Duke of Guise, also a central figure, was 21, and the Huguenot princes Navarre and Condé, 18 and 19 respectively. All of them had lost their fathers in acts of violence, deliberately in cold-blooded assassination in the cases of Guise and Condé. Already in 1569, the then 15-year-old Navarre had been berated for requesting to be able to retrieve his uncle Condé's body for burial. He'd already lost his father at the siege of Rouen in 1562 at the age of 8. But above all, St Bartholomew's would remain a traumatic episode for Navarre as for others. Unsurprisingly, fear was part of the reaction to the St Bartholomew's Day massacres. Whether among surviving Huguenots, including those that had converted like Navarre, or the royal authorities anxious about reprisal and foreign intervention, and rumours continued to swirl around the court and in Paris. The discovery of plots against the crown in 1574, about which I wrote an article in French history, reinforced royal fears of further conspiracy, while Huguenots claimed that they had been set up to justify another St Bartholomew's Day and suggested new enterprises tending to a second massacre. The memories were still raw just 20 months after the event. Questioned about the plots, Navarre highlighted the shame that he felt at having brought his close friends and companions with him to Paris, only to see them slaughtered, leaving him alone, stripped of his friends and of trust. And he observed resentfully that the crown had no grounds for suspicion of him, whereas he had been told that the plan was to undertake a second St Bartholomew, which would not spare him, while the crown promoted his enemies and the perpetrators of the massacres. The identifications of those who carried out the killings of St Bartholomew in Paris and other localities were and are well known. Some even bragged about what they had done, and all seem to have remained unpunished. Indeed, as Navarre asserted, and Foa has argued, they were effectively rewarded for their participation by the later conferring of honours or the seizure of the property of their victims. Nevertheless, Huguenots and even moderate Catholics, like Pierre de l'Étoile, looked out for and claimed that divine judgment caught up with them, with their violent or miserable ends atoning for all the innocent blood that they had spilt. But much of this reads like wishful thinking, as too with the supposed signs of remorse, and that the perpetrators, including Charles IX on his deathbed, were haunted, especially by the sounds of the massacre, the screams and cries of the victims, just as other witnesses were. So I want to move on from thinking about St Bartholomew specifically and some of the reflections on the historiography to thinking about setting it in its wider context in relation to violence more broadly as a subject of study, and also of early modern violence in particular, before returning specifically to the massacre and then returning in particular to Troyes. When discussing early modern violence, even historians not primarily interested in France, as well as political scientists and sociologists with a much more modern focus, tend to begin with, or at least to highlight, French examples. Benjamin Kaplan, for instance, observes that none of the other religious wars of the early modern era saw neighbour commit violence against neighbour on such a scale. Thus, despite having written my last monograph on peacemaking and focusing my next on clandestine activities, so notorious are the French religious wars in this regard that I'm often approached to write about violence and to speak about violence as I am today. And I can hardly complain about it either, given that I've edited volumes myself on this theme and volunteered to talk about St Bartholomew's today. More often than not, though, I'm asked to set it in the wider early modern context. So thinking about broader histories of violence, theories of violence, special issues around violence, and in relation also to civil war or cultures of war and the history of violence even more broadly. I think that these broader perspectives can be very useful. They do lend themselves to a bit of a forensic objectivity, with the horror of the violence easy to distance oneself from, as circumstance and context are microanalyzed. Violence is, of course, historically and culturally and even individually contingent and changes over time in terms of what's seen as acceptable and unacceptable levels of violence or sorts of violence. We are equally fascinated and repelled by violence, and the banality of its incidence also is often striking. St Bartholomew's Day is clearly not a uniquely traumatic episode. Contemporary comparisons are inevitable, but so are echoes of more modern conflicts, although direct equivalence stirs up many sensitivities. In this regard, the Shoah, the sectarianism of Northern Ireland, the ethnic cleansing of Bosnia, and the Rwandan genocide have all been cited. The spectre of the enemy within is also conjured up by recent acts of domestic terrorism, but these are usually indiscriminate in their targets, unlike much of the violence which characterized the Reformation period, which was localized and personal. Confessional tensions within previously harmonious and stable communities provide a clear demonstration of Anton Bloch's claim that the fiercest struggles often take place between individuals, groups, and communities that differ very little. The difficulty of reconciling opposing sides within a civil war context is also obvious, with the terms of any proposed peace often proving controversial and divisive. The relevance of this for the St Bartholomew's Day massacres is clear, but if the extent of the brutality of the French religious wars had no match on the European continent, as is sometimes said, that shouldn't allow us to overlook comparable outbreaks elsewhere in the early modern period and as part of the wider impact of the Reformation, notably in the so-called Spanish Fury in Antwerp and other military atrocities in the Netherlands in the 1570s and 80s, or the treatment of Protestant settlers in Ireland in the 1640s. The graphic descriptions of the barbaric violence meted out in the Netherlands in 1576, or in Ireland in 1641, or indeed in the Empire during the 30 Years' War, are reminiscent of that in France in various ways, including the kinds of imagery that's brought forward. Of course, this is often the biased reporting produced by the ideologically driven rhetoric of a confessional conflict, designed to demonize the other side. Nevertheless, people certainly died in their thousands, and we have corroborative testimony from more moderate Catholic observers for the generic rituals of dragging bodies through the streets and the deliberate and calculated drowning of victims in rivers. Although individual stories are harder to verify, their symbolism is as important as their veracity for our understanding of contemporary attitudes to violence, including this focus on ritual. We can end up, I think, because we become familiar with the repertoire, we can end up reading these accounts fairly objectively as part of a repertoire of martyrdom in particular. They're often familiar stories in a carefully constructed narrative. What I often find more chilling and vivid is the record of mundane and everyday existence of the victims and their families before and after their deaths, contained in tax rolls and church records of baptism, or indeed rebaptism of their own children, or acting as a godparent to another, or an occasional burial entry. Or from the accounts of survivors with regard to the sights and sounds that accompanied their escape. Contemporaries were shocked by the breakdown of normal bonds of kinship and neighbourliness by those who refused to grant shelter or even handed their acquaintances over to the killers. But it's unsurprising that few would be prepared to risk their own property and lives, both of themselves and their families, to protect others, knowing from previous experience what the perpetrators were capable of and that their actions were apparently sanctioned by the authorities. For those seeking refuge from violence were dependent on the response of those from whom they sought protection or were forced to bribe, given the season, as is often cited in the documents, and therefore the risk to themselves. This season of St Bartholomew has sinister overtones of a hunting season, and indeed contemporaries were minded to refer to the practice of Huguenot hunting, la chasse des Huguenots, as they were hunted down in their houses, in the streets, in the countryside, and on the roads as they tried to flee the kingdom. I want to turn then in my final section to the specific case of the events that took place in the town of Troyes, and some reflections on the way that the sources, specifically Huguenot sources, talk about the events, and some reflections on that sort of wider context, going back to that point about how these things were not premeditated, but in some sense were rehearsed and planned. And this is the map which was drawn for me long ago for my book on Troyes, which now looks rather beautifully childish, but it's a lovely, simplistic representation of the geography, which is really helpful actually when you're reading the kind of sources which talk about the massacre, as you can sort of follow the geography of the events taking place, and you can see sort of at the top there the prisons, which feature, of course, quite centrally to what took place at this time. In the days following the massacre in Paris, conflicting verbal reports began to arrive at the gates of Troyes. As a result, there was an increasing guard placed on these gates, and a curfew was established on the 27th of August. On the 30th of August, a week after the death of Coligny and his entourage, more than 30 Huguenots were taken and held in the town's prison. Several more of their co-religionists were killed in the streets in the days before and after. Despite the authorities having received royal letters to the contrary, the prisoners were all murdered in cold blood on the 4th of September, and the letters published on the 5th. Although there were no more murders, those Huguenots that remained hidden continued to be hunted down and hounded out. Many abjurations followed, both in private, when they were paid for, and in public at the Cathedral of Saint-Pierre. And few, it seemed, would return to the Reformed Church. So that's the sort of simple events of the massacre as it took place at Troyes. Although the number of reported victims in Troyes was relatively small, around 40, compared to other major towns such as Rouen and Lyon, where there were some 150 plus, they are all named and therefore their history is traceable. As elsewhere, including Paris, in Troyes, a familiar repertoire of intimidation and harassment, as well as arrests and imprisonment of the Huguenots, preceded the 1572 massacres over a period of at least 15 years, from when they first began to gather for worship in the later 1550s. Some figures, such as a royal bailli, Anne de Vaudreuil, who took up his office in 1559 and was a central figure in ordering the local massacre in 1572, were involved in several episodes over the years. He had been disrupting Huguenot assemblies since at least 1560 and took the initiative in driving the Huguenots out when they attempted to seize the town in April 1562. This event led to the massacre of around 140 mainly exiles from Troyes, who were holed up in nearby Bar-sur-Seine on the 24th of August, 1562, so 10 years exactly to the day before events in Paris. As well as sparking off violence against Huguenots on the streets and in the prisons of Troyes itself in 1562 and early 1563, and notably when the body of the Duke of Guise was processed through the city. Several of those involved in these incidents, and others in 1568 as well, at another time of war, both royal office holders and members of the local militia, were responsible for most of the killing in 1572. This experience meant that they were well rehearsed in their roles, and equally, they knew full well who they were targeting and where they lived, coexisting cheek by jowl with them in plain sight over at least a decade. And of course, members of this gang were well known to the Huguenots as well. Their acts of intimidation included accompanying those who undertook a door-to-door poll in Troyes in April 1563, in opposition to the official establishment of Protestant services in the suburbs, the services known as Pressages. From the early 1560s, leading members of the Reformed Church in Troyes acted openly as its representatives and deputies, attending meetings with municipal and royal officials, as well as representatives of the crown and local nobility. Their names appear on various lists of suspects, including 61 sanctioned by the Paris Parlement, accused of plotting to seize the town in April 1562, during the First War, or of attending clandestine services in prohibited locations. During wartime, Huguenot residents were taxed to cover the additional costs and singled out for searches for the illicit keeping of weaponry. They were expelled from holding office, or notably serving on the local militia, and sometimes from the town. They also absented themselves for brief periods to avoid harassment and violence, sometimes registering for longer periods in refuges abroad. During peace, they were seen regularly coming and going to services through the town gates, making them easy targets for assault and injury. The location of these services generated a fierce, ongoing, decade-long dispute between the Huguenots and the authorities, for which both sides sought official support for their cause. In May 1572, the most prominent of the Huguenots were visited in their homes to forbid them from attending services that had begun to be held at a disputed site at nearby Ile, belonging to the soon-to-be wife of the Huguenot Prince of Condé, Marie de Clèves, offering an additional layer of protection, but also, of course, of confrontation. Those who were forbidden to go chose to ignore this, and some imprisonments resulted. The Crown and Governor Guise had precluded the Marquise d'Ile from holding services because of the disruption caused, also questioning her right to do so. But she had appealed against this, and the Crown ordered those imprisoned for attending the Pressages released. Tensions continued to escalate, culminating on the 10th of August 1572, 2 weeks before the massacre in Paris, with an assault by Catholics that resulted in the death of a newly baptized infant, being carried from Ile to Troyes in the arms of its wet nurse, forcing both sides to act. It was a notable enough incident to encourage an appeal to the Crown as a clear breach of the Edict of Pacification. Now, this might appear to be an event of only passing local interest. But the reason I focused on it is because it takes us not only to Paris at the time of the Navarre-Valois wedding, where the representatives of both the Protestant and Catholics went to make their case on the eve of the massacre, but it also takes us into the bedchamber of the wounded Admiral Coligny when the King and Queen Mother came to visit, at least according to Simon Hulard. He states that an eyewitness had informed him that Coligny had raised violations of the edict with the King and cited the Troyes incident specifically. There's no direct corroboration of this, but Coligny had written to his wife on the 18th of August to say that he would be staying on after the wedding to raise such breaches with the King, despite his own preference to return and the warnings of his followers. Both the Protestant representative, Antoine Billard, who was making their case to the Crown via Coligny, and the Lieutenant Criminel, Pierre Bellin, sent by the town council, originally to secure an injunction against the services at Ile, and now arguing that the baby that they claimed had been killed had been stillborn. Both of these representatives were therefore in Paris at the time of the massacre. Having, we are told, secured judicial redress on the 22nd of August, Puillard would be lucky to escape with his life, while Bellin would be instrumental in ensuring that the massacre was extended to his fellow citizens in Troyes. He returned to Troyes on the 3rd of September, claiming to have orders from Provincial Governor Guise that it was the King's will that the massacre be continued, in clear contradiction of royal pronouncements that had been made while Bellin was still in Paris. It's unclear here, indeed, whether he was actually given these orders or whether the reliance on the word of mouth, it was said that the letter he carried said, you must believe the carrier of this message in what he reports to you about what's to be done about the Huguenots, whether it was simply him taking the initiative to say what he thought ought to happen. Supposedly, the shocked moderates on the town council withdrew on hearing this news, threatened with the label of rebel against the Crown if they objected, and leaving the most militant in charge. I want to say something now about the sort of sources for much of what took place in Troyes. And in a way, returning to these accounts has made me think in some ways about them a little bit differently, probably because of this sort of broader awareness of the wider sort of context. The main source for the events in Troyes, and indeed is the source of my quotation earlier about the belle apparence becoming du tout monstrueuse, is an anonymous manuscript account by an eyewitness, which served both as the basis for that of Simon Goulard and of our main source for the history of the reform in Troyes, Nicolas Pitou, who was by that time living elsewhere in the region, having had his property pillaged during the Third War, so he was no longer acting as an eyewitness, as in the case of this document. A comparison of these sources, rather than just sort of integrating them together, I think is quite interesting. P2 is clearly drawing from the eyewitness account. He repeats some of the same phrases, but he also reorders it in places and gives it a different emphasis to suit his narrative and reflecting his own local knowledge. In addition, his version is interwoven with 3 detailed stories of providential intervention that saved the lives of himself, the councillor Antoine Guise in Paris, and a local minister. These stories are quite disruptive to the account which P2 gives of the events in Troyes and draw our attention, I think, away from the victims to the survivors, however unintentionally. And indeed, perhaps how those survivors perhaps came to terms with why they were saved while others were not, and perhaps reflects a certain amount of guilt. But it may also simply be that P2 focused in this way because he had the first-hand details of these cases rather than needing to rely on other accounts. So this is P2's Histoire with the sort of manuscript version on the left as I look at it, and which was all I had to go on when I was doing my thesis way back when, and the now modern version which has been produced. P2's own story, written in the third person as the whole of the Histoire is, in one short folio mentions 4 times his miraculous escape, the singular providence of God, the even greater providence of God, and how by the grace of God he and his family were saved from the paws of the murderous beasts of St Bartholomew's as they fled towards the border of France to escape. Even so, he describes the potential more than actual risks of their flight, such as a fortuitous wrong turning and the diversion of his potential attackers to join up with Mem, who famously struck the fatal blow against Admiral Coligny, so again, reinforcing the dangers that he was in. Nevertheless, it must still have been a terrifying journey, whatever the need to justify their survival through divine protection. The story that P2 gives, or the account of Antoine Guillaud's story, is a familiar account of risk and intrigue, as Guillaude sought refuge with a series of friends and relatives in Paris, as word went round about the massacre, and also he heard that Belin, the Catholic representative, was on the hunt for him. Indeed, those he was staying with in Paris, who also came from Troyes or its near region, split up as they thought it would be better for their own protection. So they sought refuge with, as I say, a series of friends and relatives in Paris, who themselves were fearful for their own safety and security. He was exploited by the unscrupulous. He ended up, it's said, in the prison of the Châtelet, facing almost certain death. From where, however, he emerged unscathed by miraculous intervention, according to P2. But which he doesn't actually elaborate upon, saying it needs to be kept quiet. And Guillaude was ultimately saved by a monk who insisted that he convert, which seems rather less miraculous, until he could return safely to Troyes. Indeed, looking at the particular case of Guillaude, he might well have reflected on his recurring good fortune in defying death. During the First War, he was implicated in the 1562 plot to seize the town, but managed to evade arrest and imprisonment until January 1563. He was included on the Parlement's list of suspects that year, but managed to delay going to trial and to avoid the violence against his fellow prisoners, some claimed through bribery, although he denied this, and was subsequently freed by virtue of the 1563 Edict of Pacification, and continued to represent his co-religionists. In October 1568, at the beginning of the Third War, he was replaced in office, but was back as a Huguenot representative in March 1571. And of course, he continued to act as representative, which ended up with him being in Paris at the time of the massacre. After his possibly providential but doubtless harrowing escape from Paris, he appears in the Troyes tax register for 1573, still paying a substantial levy of 36 livres. Pitou also emphasises the corrupt behaviour of his fellow Troyens de la religion, as he called them, prior to the massacre, without stating but certainly implying that this may have justified their punishment. But did this include those murdered, he later described as martyrs? And he also focused on the divine justice and righteous vengeance which lay in wait for the perpetrators, who failed to heed the clear warnings that they'd been given to desist. This providential aspect is largely lacking, however, in the eyewitness account I mentioned earlier. Preferring celestial signs and presages, which you probably can't quite see, but he talks about the domination of Mars, of all the planets in that year, for instance. There are other references to celestial signs. Seems to prefer this sort of idea of presages rather than acts of divine judgment. Indeed, looking and comparing the sources together, they agreed on the presages which came about as a result of the collapse of buildings in Troyes in 1571, in some cases actually injuring some of those who were later involved in the massacres, or indeed killing some who'd been involved in violence against the Huguenots before. But in another example, the timing of crop failure and subsequent high prices and famine, they were not at all in agreement, with Pitou setting this much later in 1573 as a clear indication of divine punishment for the fact that the massacres had taken place. Another contrast is Pitou's final lament against the municipal officials who failed to prevent the massacre in Troyes, whereas the eyewitness provides a sonnet placing the blame squarely on the king and the queen mother, going back to some of that sort of propagation of the Black legend earlier on. The sonnet ends, "O king, without faith, without law, nor equity," of course, the idea of the roi, une roi, une foi, une roi. All of this is gone. Roi, ennemi de justice et piété. So the king, enemy of justice and piety, and justice and piety were the symbols of Charles IX. France, who has from your infamous breast received covertly and too much suckled the vicious seed of Tuscany. So that's a comparison of those sources, but it's Gulum, I think, who actually provides the most coherent and succinct account, and who seizes the significance of events in the context of the long-running conflict in Troyes over the location of services, and also the national resonance with the infringement of the edicts that threatened the future of confessional peace. The significance of the war of attrition over the services was both symbolic and actual, with both sides in Troyes prepared to continue the fight to seek a resolution in their favour. And it is Gulum who places in the mouth of the bailli and de Vaudreuil, as the royal letters of the 28th and 30th of August that he had held back until after the massacre, forbidding any further bloodshed and for Huguenots to remain quietly and unmolested in their homes. When they were belatedly read out, Gulum said that as each term or point in the letters was made, that de Vaudreuil declared a point de prêche and no services, symbolising the ultimate victory. In the spring of 1564, 9 women from Troyes sought justice and compensation through the King's Council for the murder of their head of household as a result of confessional strife during the First War. In 1573, several widows in Troyes were listed as poor in the city's tax roll for the year following the massacre of their husbands. It would not be until 1576 that Article 32 of the Peace Edict declared the widows and children of those killed in whichever part of the kingdom exempt from impositions and taxes, according to their status, for the next 6 years, which royal officials were ordered to ensure. By then, the church in Troyes had dwindled through conversion, death, or exile. Seemingly abandoned by their king and by God, ground down by the violence against them, there were insufficient numbers to reconstitute the church or its services in Troyes. For them, the season of St Bartholomew was indeed a pivotal and decisive event from which they would and could not fully recover. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Penny, for such a rich and enthralling talk. I can see we're starting to get questions coming through already. I get to applaud, although I do now have a cat on my lap, so I'm not sure I can do that very loudly. But everybody else, feel free to express your thanks and gratitude in the chat. Thank you, everybody, for coming back promptly and for starting to get the ball rolling with some questions. So we've got some already in the Q&A. I've also had one sent to me directly. So we've got different ways of getting your questions across, but please do pop your questions in the Q&A. I think there are some students out there as well, so if there are any people there who are wanting to ask some questions, please do. This is an excellent opportunity. So I'm going to start, Penny, with a question from Jeffrey Parker, who notes this was a wonderful presentation. Thank you. And goes on to say, your discovery that at Troyes the Catholics often already knew their victims personally, sometimes because they had identified themselves with petitions and so on, reminds him of Foa's discovery of much the same in Paris. But surely by August 1572, everybody knew the religion of their neighbours. Once there was a license to kill, they knew who to kill, and he further comments that that was certainly the case in Ireland in October 1641. Did everybody know the religion of their neighbours?
Well, yes, absolutely. And that was really one of the points I was trying to make, that these people had openly identified themselves by that point. You could only really say during the sort of late 1550s, when they were still meeting underground, not literally underground, but, you know, behind closed doors. So it was much less clear. And of course, people changed religion too. And I think converts were just as much worried about, you know, the fact that they had previously been Huguenot not being forgotten in a sense. But you also have incidents where certainly when the, if we think of 1563 as the example, when they go around doing the poll in Troyes and asking people what they thought about whether services should be allowed in the suburbs, some people were absent, and you had their neighbours actually attesting to their soundness, to that they were good Catholics and this sort of thing, even though I know in some cases they certainly weren't. So there was that sort of protectiveness as well to some extent. So I think, yeah, it's not at all surprising that people knew, because it was very open by 1572. So that should be of no surprise to us, that they not only knew who they were, but where they lived. I suppose it's the accumulation of time, and therefore whether, and long periods of coexistence when these individuals were living alongside one another, and why 1572 marks a particular turning point when that is no longer possible, even despite those earlier incidents.
Thank you. And we have a sort of follow-up comment in the Q&A from Susan Emmanuel, sort of picking up on something that Jérémie Foa has said as well about the mutilation of bodies, suggesting a ritual aspect to the massacre. I'm not sure if that's something that you want to sort of pick up on now, or maybe come back
to.
I
mean, there are certainly examples of that in Troyes, not so much at the time of the St Bartholomew's Day massacre, because most of it is I don't want to go into the detail really, but you know, simple cold-blooded killing in the prisons is without any ceremony, and certainly without any kind of sense of ritual about it. Some more of the sort of dragging through the streets and so on, and throwing in the waters is certainly part of it at an earlier period. There are certainly examples of that, and in 1562 there's probably more examples of, at least reports of, that ritual taking place.
Thank you. David van der Linden, thank you, Penny. Could you talk a bit more about the widows seeking compensation? What exactly did they ask, and on what grounds? How did the monarchy motivate its decision to grant them a tax exemption, seeing as there was oubliant civil crimes, including the massacre? And do you know of comparable cases elsewhere in France?
Yeah, so 1564 is very specifically widows from Troyes to the King's Council. Unfortunately, we don't know too much detail because the record is quite brief, that they requested compensation, and we don't know whether it was awarded. In 1576, when the King actually declares that the families are going to be compensated, that's in an edict of pacification, so it applies to the whole of France. Again, I mean, I'm not sure to what extent that was honoured. However, it also reflects the fact that during times of peace, during times of war, of course, Huguenot property was confiscated and then was supposed to be returned during peacetime. There have been ongoing issues around that, and further causes of tension as a result of that. Was the question, sorry, I need to probably look at the question more precisely, was the question about why the Crown does this, or
how did the monarchy motivate its decision to grant them a tax exemption?
Why was it? Well, of course, 1576 edict was the most liberal in a sense in terms of permitting Huguenot worship, and I think there was a sense of actually trying to sort of right some of the wrongs of the past. It says in the edict that this was done completely, you know, against the will and pleasure of the monarch, who of course by that point was Henry III. So big question marks about whether that's really an honest statement, but it is part of a wider policy to pacify the tensions. And also I think, and this was about also the question was, sorry, is about when they're supposed to forget what's taken place. And again, this is a big contradiction in the edicts that very specifically ask people to forget, but then later on within the terms actually then state that they have to do certain things that they were doing up to a certain date. So they're asking them to remember at the same time as they're trying to forget. So it's that there's always a contradiction in a sense in what's being asked of people. Because they're asked to, you know, stipulate what they were doing at particular dates, even though they're supposed to have forgotten everything about the wars.
It always seems such a big ask, the forgetting. So we have a question from Hilary Bernstein, who is intrigued by your anonymous account of the Massacre from Troyes. Especially the first person narrative seems unusual for the time. Could you say more about this manuscript? And if it is autographed, then the quality of the writing, which seemed quite nice from your pictures.
Yeah.
And the sonnet should make the author not that difficult to identify. Almost
printed. I mean, it's very easy to read. It's very readable. It ends with fin, end. So it seems to, I would say it's been written for a very specific purpose. The first page seems to have been written after the rest of it because it doesn't fit quite with the second page, which seems to be the beginning because it's got that decorated, I could call it a decorated letter. I have a hunch about who it might be. I didn't like to say but I don't know for sure, but I think it might be, just through circumstance, it might be a figure called Christophe de Vassar, who was actually married to Pitou's sister, half-sister, and also was one of those who hid during the St Bartholomew's Day massacre in Troyes and survived. So we know he was there. We know he was close to Pitou, who obviously picked up the account. So that's sort of my hunch, but I'd have to go a bit further in terms of finding out whether it was definitely him.
Excellent. We have a question from Mary. You mentioned historical comparisons with the massacres in Ireland in 1641. Were there comparisons with religious persecution under the Tudors in England being made at the time?
At the time?
I'm adding the at the time, but...
Of course, the in English were horrified by the events of St Bartholomew's Day. And, you know, this was seen as a particularly heinous sort of action by the French. I mean, I think certainly in terms of large-scale massacre, it was highly unusual. If you compare it to the actions of the English in Ireland in the 16th century, then I think there are certainly comparisons to be made. But there was I think, you know, the difference here as well is that it's French on French. So I don't know, there aren't direct comparisons made, except to say, you know, that this is what the French do. And, you know, we have reports obviously from the English ambassadors in Paris, and indeed Francis Walsingham, of course, was famously the English ambassador to France at the time. But others report about the kind of ritual violence. For instance, we have quite a lot of reports from English ambassadors about that as well, which is you know, really striking to contemporaries.
Thank you very much. Our next question sort of coming over two, so I'm just going to condense. So from Claire MacLeod, was wondering if you could speak about how the massacre sort of links up with the 1685 revocation of the Edict of Nantes. Were there comparisons made between the revocation and the massacre by contemporaries?
I'd need to know more about the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, wouldn't I? Because it could only be done that way around. I mean, the comparisons, I suppose, are obviously the sort of dragonade of actually, you know, an intimidation of the Huguenots at that time. Obviously, they're a much smaller group. They pose less of a threat. I mean, that was what, of course, Philip Benedict said about the St Bartholomew's Day massacres in the provinces, that it was in those towns it took place where the Huguenots still posed something of a threat. So I think, you know, it's geographically a different situation. It's politically a different situation. It's in almost every sense a different situation, except for the fact, of course, that you've got the link with the Edict of Nantes, and ultimately its revocation was excused on the basis that there weren't that. But that's, again, an argument that's used in the 16th century, that we don't need to have services here because there aren't that many Protestants in this town. It's used in Troyes, it's used elsewhere. It's quite a common one. So, but I would be interested to know what was, you know, whether, I'm sure there must have been direct references to religious wars at the time of the revocation, just as indeed there were in relation to the revolution as well, later on, about the levels of violence.
Thank you. The questions are coming thick and fast now, so I'm trying to keep a track of them. Annette Finley-Crosswhite mentions that she's moved away a bit from 16th century history and has been writing more about the Holocaust, and that your talk reminded her of Jan Gross's book Neighbours and the murder of Jews by their neighbours in Poland in 1941. And some recent Holocaust scholars like Wendy Lower have focused on the Holocaust as a family event, in that families were destroyed often in the most horrible ways in terms of atrocity. And so she would posit that the destruction in this case of the season of St Bartholomew involved neighbour on neighbour violence, but it also forced familial destruction in a way that the Huguenot movement could never rebuild itself. The destruction was intimate that way and targeted social structure by destroying families. And of course, families are the essence of the church. And she says that's not so much a question as an observation, but she invites you to comment.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And evidently the work of Natalie Davis in particular started that focus on the kinds of violence, ritualized violence, particularly, and it's often cited in the sources as well about attacks on pregnant women, and, you know, the destruction of families, the destruction of children, that it made no you know, difference between age or sex, as that's so often cited. And so I think there are some real parallels to be had, and that's something which indeed Jérémie Foa has mentioned as well in relation to the Shah and so on. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I'm sure there are all kinds of parallels with other kinds of religious tension in other circumstances. The same with the sort of Jewish, Muslim, Christian relations in the late Middle Ages as well. There are all kinds of comparisons I think can be made there.
Thank you. Elisa Jones really found the three approaches to the massacre as an event that you highlighted as a historiographical debate in the history of violence, as a micro-history on a local scale, led her to wonder if the local realities of the personal nature of the St Bartholomew's Day massacre and related violence in the wars of religion can and should be applied to the broader use of these as examples of religious or civil violence in the longer interdisciplinary narratives of violence, secularization and tolerance. What are the stakes between these narratives, or in not flattening the nature of these conflicts?
Wow. That's an enormous challenge. I mean, I made a decision at some point to approach it in these three ways, partly because I was just dealing with such a vast area, and really what is possible to contribute to it, especially for an audience that some of whom will be very well informed and others who would not. So I'm glad you thought it worked. I wasn't quite so sure myself. I felt like it was quite a challenge, and whether it quite cohered. But I mean, I think you're right. I mean, if this is what, in a sense, we're saying, I mean, as well, I mean, it's necessary to drill down to the sort of individual experience as part of an understanding of that sort of wider context. Because there are, as I say, there are so many ways into thinking about the St Bartholomew's Day massacre and what it meant for individuals, for communities, for countries, for the wider international sort of context and the Reformation. But I mean, that's a really interesting set of questions which I probably need to reflect on a bit more.
I'm sure Elisa won't mind you reflecting. It was that's a really useful question. Brian Sandberg would like to ask about the empowerment of the militia as legitimate executors of justice and executioners, and the radicalized Catholic extremism of the militia companies. Are the militia as prominent in Troyes?
Sorry, I'm trying to sort of pick up these questions as well as they come on. Yeah, I mean, they as I said, I think, you've got the same group of people who are going around enforcing what the authorities ask them to do. I mean, a lot of this, of course, is coming through from some of the Huguenot accounts, so they're depicted in a certain kind of way. So they're seen, their presence is seen as sinister, but their presence, for instance, when they went around doing the poll sort of door to door in 1563 is kind of sort of understandable, because the militia companies are sort of in charge of the guard of particular districts within the town. They're going around those particular districts of the town because they know, that's what they're asked to do. They clearly are taking direct instruction from certain individuals in the municipal council who don't themselves get their hands dirty, and royal officials as well in the case of St Bartholomew's. But the mayor as well is quite central in both 1562 and 1572 in giving instructions to the militia to carry out their charge. So I think they are an important sort of central feature. And of course, as I mentioned, the Protestants were excluded from the militia, so that they are very vulnerable in those circumstances.
Thank you. We have a question from Alexa Clark, who thanks you for the lecture. She would like to know about Catherine de' Medici. How fair is it that Catherine has received so much of the blame for the massacre taking place? Do we think this is based in some truth, or does it speak more to contemporary attitudes about women in power, particularly in France, what with Salic law?
I'd say yes and no. I think she was unfairly treated, you know, as being seen as having plotted this. It runs completely counter to her policy around the edicts of pacification, which she set such store. So in terms of other, you know, research that I've done, I don't see her in that mold. She clearly got pretty fed up with everybody sort of undermining the policy that she was carrying through. I think she's somebody you have to admire because she was right at the centre of things for so very long, whatever her character was. And different historians take different views on her, but it seems to me, you know, from 1559 when her husband dies, and she's really quite a very marginal figure at that point. And then, of course, she comes to be more and more important. And, you know, she's for another 30 years after her husband dies, and as each of her sons served as king and she served as regent, but even when she wasn't regent, she was still very powerful. And everybody doesn't just write to the king, they write to Catherine as well. So, you know, she's incredibly powerful. You know, I mean, I think you can, I think that, yeah, I mean, she's neither blameless nor the only one to blame, I think, in terms of the St Bartholomew's Day massacre in particular. But it's I think like many others were caught up in the events of that moment.
Thank you. And she, of course, is somebody who's sort of been so fascinating for popular culture ever since, really.
I mean, certainly the Black Legend feeds on the misogyny and the anti-Italianism and so on. Absolutely, yeah.
We've got sort of a number of comments coming through in the questions as well, but I'm going to try and focus a bit more on the questions at the moment, because I think the comments are things that perhaps you might want to reflect on later. So Mark Greengrass has a question about the experience of what modern psychiatrists who specialise in post-trauma therapy refer to as memory amplification. One way by which people seem to come to terms with what they've experienced is to add colour from what they've heard from others. Should we not expect this to be occurring amongst those accounts from survivors that are put together by Gulum and the other accounts we've heard of? For example, the attempted assassination of Coligny that was in the immediate trigger for the massacres. Implicitly, the question is not to bring into doubt the traumatic experience they suffered, but about how difficult it is for us as historians to hold such accounts at a critical distance. Given how many students I think are in this audience, I think that's a really useful question.
Yeah, again, a really challenging one. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. And these episodes are very emotive, obviously, both for those who were there, but even, you know, those who live with the legacy, and even to sometimes cast doubt on some of those memories and accounts, and I'm talking in a very general sense as well, is sometimes seen as unacceptable, and that critical eye is questioned. And as you say, it's not about saying that these episodes didn't take place, but that they may have not quite taken place in the way that they're talked about. And the ritual violence is one of those. We have really very little in the way of independent reports on those, or objective evidence, let's put it that way, rather than independent reports. And they fit very much with the cultural repertoire. But I think that cultural repertoire itself is very interesting and tells us a lot about the context and the way that people process these kinds of events. So I think the trauma, and it comes through in accounts as well. When I mentioned about Navarre, but I think it's often, and again, that sort of, you know, the age at which they're participating in this and being, you know, impacted by what's taking place with the massacres. I think it's really interesting, and of course we have the accounts, and P2, I mean, he very much focuses, the other thing I should have said, he focuses very much on the notables and their experience. We don't get so much of the the everyday experiences, which is why, you know, Jérémie Foa's approach is really interesting, and took me back to some extent to Foa, where I'd already established a lot of those links between the victims and the perpetrators, but actually sort of thinking about that a bit more deeply as well, and thinking about how I can reconstruct those stories a bit more exactly. As I say, I find has more of an impact on me is actually the everyday stuff rather than the particular trauma of the episode itself, in a sense. But thank you for that question.
Yeah, thank you for all the questions. I think as we're coming up to half past the hour, you've had some very big questions there to answer. I think it's only fair that we say thank you very much once again, and I'm sorry we didn't get to all your questions, but that was a really great array of responses. And Penny, thank
fabulous
you.
Questions. I hope I've got some record of them, and I wish very much that I could share a glass of wine with all of you. That's my
Absolutely. Thank you all very much for attending, for your questions. If you'd like to share your appreciation in the chat once more for Penny and for her patience with all of us, thank you very much.